February 24th, 1981. Lady Diana Spencer stands outside St. James's Palace in thin winter light, wearing a blue silk suit and smiles. She is 19 years old and has been formally engaged to the Prince of Wales for approximately 45 minutes. The cameras record everything: the slight tilt of her head, the modest deflection of her gaze, the warmth that seems to come so naturally it barely looks managed. Photographs from that morning would circulate for decades. In them, she looks like exactly what the palace intended: a soft beginning to a great story. Somewhere nearby, watching, is the Queen Mother. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon is 80 years old that February. She has been smiling at cameras since before the oldest photographer in that courtyard was born. Cecil Beaton, who spent 5 decades photographing her, reached for a strange phrase to describe what her smile actually was: a marshmallow made on a welding machine. Soft on the surface, something structural underneath. The writer Stephen Tennant was less metaphorical. She looked everything that she wasn't: gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil, she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. The Queen Mother smiled like a woman protecting a system. Diana smiled like a woman trying to survive one. To the outside world, both appeared warm, feminine, accessible, practically soft. Inside the palace, they belonged to different centuries. The Queen Mother believed that pain should be dressed, powdered, hidden, and carried into the next room without complaint. Diana believed that pain would eventually find a way out, and when it did, the cameras would be waiting. So when Diana entered the royal family in 1981, she wasn't simply meeting an elderly grandmother figure. She was meeting the living embodiment of the rule she would one day break. Never tell the truth if the truth makes the monarchy look cruel. The Queen Mother's Code. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon didn't choose public life so much as have it thrust upon her with the force of history. She married Prince Albert, a shy, stammering second son with no expectation of the throne, in 1923, anticipating a quieter version of royalty as the consort of a man never meant to reign. Then December 1936 arrived. Edward VIII abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee the institution couldn't accommodate, and Elizabeth's husband became George VI, against both their wishes. She called the new role an intolerable honor. That phrase deserves attention. It didn't deny the distress. Her biographer, William Shawcross, working with unrestricted access to her personal papers, diaries, and private correspondence for his authorized 2009 biography, documented genuine anguish in the private record. What he found was a full inner life of fury and devastation. But she chose the formulation intolerable honor rather than catastrophe or disaster, or any of the more direct alternatives available to a woman in genuine pain. She picked words that acknowledge the weight while refusing to name the wound. Then she went to work. Her private feelings about Wallis Simpson operated in an entirely different register. Biographer Ingrid Seward later concluded that the Queen Mother's attitude toward the Windsors bordered on a vendetta. She reportedly referred to Simpson in private as the lowest of the low, strong language from a woman who never deployed anything like it in public. She watched the Duchess of Windsor, as Simpson became, receive occasional invitations to royal functions, with a containment those around her understood was costing something. 40 years of suppressed fury, maintained behind pastel twin sets and a string of pearls, not once publicly stated, not once formally acknowledged. Shawcross eventually found the explicit philosophical statement.
It arrived
as these things tend to, in the form of a practical observation. It's always a mistake to talk about your marriage. Treated as a governing principle, which it was, that sentence means what passes between a royal woman and her institutional role stays inside that role. Confession is betrayal. Vulnerability is vulgarity. The public face isn't a performance maintained with visible effort. It's the only legitimate face that should exist. The war made the code load-bearing. On September 13, 1940, 2 SC-50 cylindrical bombs struck Buckingham Palace while the King and Queen were in residence, the third of 9 times the palace would be bombed over the course of the war. The Queen wrote about the experience to her mother-in-law, Queen Mary. That letter is preserved in the Royal Collection Trust archives. Its tone is precise. She describes the physical shock, the closeness of the danger, the way the blast moved through the building. And then she converts the entire event into an argument for why she could now stand alongside the people of the East End rather than merely express sympathy from behind palace gates. "I'm glad we've been bombed," she told the press. "It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Personal danger transformed into institutional solidarity. Damage converted into narrative. The operation was also precise. A real emotion redirected outward in service of duty, rather than turned inward toward any private reckoning. The East End walkabouts were physically harder than the public record usually captures. She moved through streets that still smelled of burned timber and disturbed earth, where rubble had been pushed to the verges and families stood in front of buildings open to the sky. She wore gloves and good shoes. The residents around her had been sleeping in tube stations. Her hat was intact. Their kitchens weren't. She was sometimes booed when she first appeared. The gap between her world and theirs was visible and tactile, and the residents of Whitechapel and Stepney weren't required to find a visiting queen consoling. She absorbed that too. She kept coming back, week after week, through 1940 and 1941, walking the sites, speaking to people, kneeling beside the injured, expressing what seemed like genuine sorrow, because it was. But the composure never broke. The devastation she encountered registered as grief only in private. In public, it became something more useful. Visible solidarity, controlled empathy, warmth carefully channeled toward the institutional purpose of maintaining morale during the worst crisis the monarchy had faced in decades. Her private correspondence tells a different story from her public expression. Her public face told the story the country needed to believe. This was her technique in its purest form. Pain as raw material, composure as processed output, the institution as the only legitimate recipient of the emotional labor she was performing. William Shawcross's authorized biography describes her as a woman possessing great natural charm and equally great strength of character. Hugo Vickers's 2005 study arrives at a sharper formulation, that she looked everything that she wasn't, that the exterior and interior were separate constructions maintained in deliberate parallel. What the record describes consistently is a deep conviction, quietly held but never abandoned, that her personal pain had no legitimate claim on public space. The institution mattered. The individual served it. She didn't think this was cruelty. She thought it was the price of civilization. Diana enters the system. The Spencer family had been adjacent to royalty for generations. Diana's maternal grandmother, Lady Fermoy, served as lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. Lord Fermoy had been a friend of the royal family. Diana grew up at Park House on the Sandringham estate, within the orbit of the royal family's most private annual rituals, the shooting weekends, the Christmas gatherings, the particular domestic rhythms of Windsor and Balmoral that outsiders never see. She was, in the language of palace selection, already calibrated, a known quantity from a known family. Born July 1, 1961, the third daughter of John Spencer, later the 8th Earl Spencer, she became Lady Diana Spencer at 14 when her father received his earldom. Charles had first encountered her in 1977 while visiting Althorpe as a companion of her older sister Sarah. He didn't think of her as a romantic possibility for another 3 years. By the summer of 1980, under mounting pressure about the reputational damage being done by lingering press speculation about his intentions, Charles reassessed. He proposed in February 1981. Diana answered him on tape, years later, with an accuracy that reads now like forensics. He said, "Will you marry me?" And I laughed. I remember thinking, this is a joke. He was deadly serious. He said, "You do realize that one day you will be queen." And a voice said to me inside, "You won't be queen, but you'll have a tough role." She told him she loved him. He replied, "Whatever love means." She was 19 years old. She had met him approximately 13 times in person before that morning. The engagement announcement on February 24, 1981, produced the blue silk suit and the cameras and the smile already documented. The Guardian's assessment the following morning: a 19-year-old girl of charm, media-hardened tact, and high aristocratic background, in line to be Britain's 48th queen. The description is precise about the institutional calculation. Aristocratic lineage, present. Familiarity with royal households from childhood, present. Photogenic in a suitable, rather than distracting manner, present. Untouched by scandal, young enough to be shaped by the institution rather than resistant to it. From a family the palace already trusted. All present. Lord Mountbatten had advised Charles before his assassination in 1979 that for a wife he should find a suitable, attractive, and sweet-charactered girl before she has met anyone else she might fall for. Diana met the criteria. What the palace had no mechanism for measuring, what its selection criteria had no category for, was what Diana was underneath those qualifications. Tina Brown in the Diana Chronicles credits her with wicked sense of humor, her keen natural intelligence, and sharp instincts. These were qualities that would eventually make her extraordinary in public and ungovernable in private. The wedding took place on July 29, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral, before 3,500 invited guests and the global television audience estimated at 750 million. Diana was 20 years old. Charles was 32, 12 years her senior. The night before the ceremony, she told Morton, "I felt I was a lamb to the slaughter. I knew it, and couldn't do anything about it." What followed the wedding was neither the public withdrawal of a woman overwhelmed by attention, nor the discreet adjustment of someone finding her footing in a new role. It was the systematic discovery, month by month, that the institution she had entered had no interest in who she actually was, only in what she could produce and what she could sustain without complaint. In the first weeks of the marriage, Charles's former attachment to Camilla Parker Bowles made itself felt in small signals that a woman with Diana's perceptive range was uniquely positioned to detect and unable to simply set aside. Telephone calls she wasn't meant to overhear, schedule arrangements that seemed to accommodate someone else's presence. The particular chill of a household that has organized itself around an absence it expects you not to notice. She noticed. She was, as Diana later told Morton, in a very bad way by October 1981, 3 months after the wedding, struggling with bulimia and clinical depression. The photographs from those months showed a smiling princess performing the role. The photographs were the role. Behind them, the accumulation had already begun. The palace had selected a young woman for the impression she would make on cameras and the children she might produce for the succession. It had not planned for what happened when a woman with that degree of emotional sensitivity encountered that degree of emotional abandonment. What the old women expected. No one sat Diana down with a manual. The expectation was transmitted by something more effective than instruction: atmosphere, example, and the absolute absence of any alternative permission structure. Senior royal women around her, the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, had each spent decades absorbing the same lesson through different routes. Emotional self-containment wasn't a policy they articulated, it was simply the condition of membership. Fertility mattered to the institution. Discretion mattered. Obedience to the requirements of the role was assumed as the baseline, not the ceiling. Personal pain occupied a category the institution had never formally agreed to accommodate publicly, because accommodating it publicly would have required acknowledging that the role demanded personal pain, and that acknowledgement was precisely what the code existed to prevent. The message Diana received about her own distress was transmitted most clearly in how that distress was received. When her depression and emotional volatility became visible, when staff had to manage her crises, when her physical symptoms couldn't be contained within the performance of normality, the Queen Mother's response, according to Andrew Morton's documented account, was to dismiss her complaints as the imaginings of a silly girl. Other senior royals echoed the characterization. This wasn't cruelty in the ordinary sense. It was the assessment of women who had absorbed far heavier institutional demands and absorbed them in public silence. In their framework, what Diana was experiencing was the difficult initiation period of royal marriage. The correct response was to get through it quietly. Princess Margaret's trajectory offers the closest parallel and the most precise illustration of the code's costs. Initially, she had been warm to Diana. The two women were neighbors at Kensington Palace, both metropolitan rather than country estate women, and Morton records Margaret putting her arm around the young princess and accompanying her on ordinary outings. Diana told Morton, "I've always adored Margot. I love her to bits, and she has been wonderful to me from day one." But Margaret had also paid the institution's price in full, in her own currency. In the 1950s, she had been in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, an equerry with whom she had formed a genuine attachment, and a divorced man, which meant the church and the institution had the same answer. She complied. She subsequently married Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, a marriage that ended in divorce in 1978. Both the sacrificed relationship and the failed marriage were absorbed publicly without complaint. What Margaret did with her private feelings about any of this isn't fully recorded. What is recorded is that she kept those feelings private. She had made her peace with the code, at the cost of considerable personal unhappiness, and she had received in return what the code offered: the institution's loyalty, the security of her position, the particular freedom that comes from never having been publicly exposed as anything other than what the role required her to be. When Diana began to refuse to pay similar costs, when she began speaking into a tape machine at Kensington Palace for a biographer named Andrew Morton, Margaret's warmth curdled into something more complicated than simple hostility. The women of that generation had each made their sacrifice in silence. Diana's refusal felt, to those women, like a retroactive accusation, that the sacrifice had been unnecessary, that compliance had been a choice rather than a requirement. Accepting that conclusion meant questioning the structure of their own lives. None of them could. Diana's gift for reading rooms. What made Diana genuinely dangerous to the old code wasn't stubbornness or calculated strategy. It was perception, the acute, constitutive capacity to read what a room was feeling and respond to it at a frequency most people can't access. Historian Robert Lacey identified it directly. One of the things that Diana introduced into modern royalty was the concept of conveying a sense of caring for people. Offered as a compliment, this is also a structural diagnosis. The same instinct that made Diana extraordinary in public, the kneeling to speak to children at eye level, the holding of hands at hospital bedsides, the ability to register and mirror another person's emotional state almost instantaneously, was the same instinct that made her constitutionally incompatible with a world built on controlled emotional opacity. She could feel the management. She could sense, with an accuracy the documentary record supports, that the warmth extended to her by the senior royals was performed rather than genuine. She could read the gap between the face and the reality behind it. She described what she found in the early years of the marriage as a bleak emotional landscape, to Morton on tape. Her accounts, later published verbatim in the expanded 1997 edition of Morton's book, describe a young woman who wasn't imagining the hostility around her. She felt isolated at royal residences. The atmosphere was cold in the specific way that institutions are cold when they have decided that your distress is an administrative inconvenience rather than a human fact. That perceptive capacity eventually redirected itself, instinctively rather than strategically, toward the public rather than the institution. Her first walkabout after the wedding revealed the mechanism. She had what observers described as a natural instinct for emotional engagement, a responsiveness to strangers that went beyond protocol and produced, in the people she met, something the palace had never managed to manufacture through formal means. In 1984, she walked into a children's ward and, as one account records it, left her titles somewhere in the corridor. In March 1987, she shook hands without gloves with an AIDS patient at the Middlesex Hospital, at a time when physical contact with HIV-positive individuals remained, for significant portions of the public, a territory of anxiety and avoidance. The gesture was instinctive, accompanied by eye contact and what those present described as genuine warmth. The image circulated globally and produced a documented shift in how the British public understood the disease and the people living with it. The palace had not planned this. It couldn't have planned it. Diana stated the underlying dynamic of her relationship with the palace's old code herself in the Panorama interview. Maybe I was the first person ever to be in this family who ever had depression or was ever openly tearful. And obviously that was daunting, because if you've never seen it before, how do you support it? It gave everybody a wonderful new label: Diana's unstable and Diana's mentally unbalanced. And unfortunately, that seems to have stuck. The palace's response to her emotional distress had always followed the same logic: contain, minimize, wait for the instability to resolve into the expected performance. Diana's instability didn't resolve. It escalated.
And she, unlike the women before her, found that the same emotional intelligence that made her suffering so acute also made her extraordinarily readable to a public that was watching. Her emotional intelligence and her emotional vulnerability weren't separable. They were the same quality from different angles. She could read rooms because she had spent years needing to read them to survive. The Queen Mother's Code required the suppression of precisely this kind of perception. Diana couldn't suppress it. Eventually, she stopped trying. Charles, Camilla, and the arrangement. Charles first met Camilla Shand in 1971. She married Andrew Parker Bowles in July 1973. Charles married Diana in July 1981. The timeline carries its own argument. A significant emotional attachment that predated the marriage by a decade persisted through it, and that the palace's framework had no formal mechanism for resolving, only for concealing. Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography of Charles documents that the affair resumed in 1986, 5 years into the marriage. Diana had known something was wrong considerably earlier. Morton records her describing how she had overheard Charles on a mobile telephone speaking in a voice that she recognized as not meant for her. "Whatever happens, I will always love you." Brief, unmistakable. She didn't need to hear the name. By 1989, awareness had converted into direct confrontation. At a birthday party for a mutual friend, she found Camilla, and the conversation was short, documented, and stripped of all diplomatic cushioning. "I'd just like you to know that I know exactly what is going on," Diana said. "I want my husband." What she was supposed to do next, what the institutional framework expected, what the code required, was to absorb what she had confirmed and continue the public performance. That was the arrangement. Not the affair itself, necessarily, the silence surrounding it. The institutional expectation is documented through pattern rather than explicit directive. One source describes the Queen Mother as relatively broad-minded about Charles's connection to Camilla Parker Bowles, as long as he was discreet. Whether or not those are her precise words, the posture they describe is entirely consistent with the multi-generational code she had spent her life embodying. The expectation wasn't that the affair would end. It was that it would stay invisible, that Charles would exercise the discretion required of a man in his position, and that Diana would perform the discretion required of a woman in hers. What that looked like in practical terms was a specific kind of erasure. Diana was expected to register the reality of the relationship and carry that knowledge forward without comment into the next public engagement, to see it and say nothing. She was known, as multiple sources confirm, for the protectiveness the Queen Mother extended toward Charles. Her private accommodation of his situation with Camilla appears to have been an expression of that protectiveness. Not a failure of moral clarity, but a considered institutional decision. From inside her framework, this was simply what the monarchy required: discretion, maintenance of surfaces, the eternal preference of managed reality over public truth. She had organized her own life around exactly this principle. She couldn't understand why Diana's version of it would be different. In June 1992, Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story, was published. Diana had secretly made recordings at Kensington Palace in 1991, speaking into a tape machine in answer to questions relayed by her close friend, Dr. James Colthurst. Morton received the tapes through Colthurst. Both Diana and Morton publicly denied her involvement to protect her from palace retaliation. But the book's cover carried a Patrick de Marchelier photograph whose copyright belonged exclusively to Diana. The palace understood the signal immediately. What the book contained wasn't diplomacy. She had made herself sick 4, sometimes 5 times a day, with bulimia. She had attempted suicide multiple times. She was haunted by Camilla Parker Bowles, Morton wrote. Standing on top of a wooden staircase during pregnancy, she had hurled herself to the ground, landing at the bottom. Vogue's contemporaneous assessment: sensational revelations about the royal family are nothing new. But what distinguishes the latest story is that Princess Diana's marriage made her so unhappy that she tried to kill herself, and it seemed to carry her approval. The institution's private reality had entered the public record. There was no mechanism for retrieving it. The generation that could not translate. The senior royal women's reactions to the Morton book were something more complicated than simple hostility. They were the responses of women who had made enormous personal sacrifices for a code that was now destroying itself in public, in their names, through a woman they had welcomed into the institution. Princess Margaret wrote Diana a series of letters in the summer of 1992. Morton describes them as ranging from the accusatory to the sympathetic and affectionate, a range that reveals the complexity of her position better than any single response could. Part of Margaret recognized Diana's pain because she had felt versions of it herself. She had experienced a troubled royal marriage and the particular loneliness of a role that permits no external accounting of what it costs. The other part of her couldn't accept what Diana had done with that pain. Not because the pain was illegitimate, but because making it public was, in her framework, categorically impermissible, regardless of its contents. For the Queen Mother's generation, the argument wasn't about facts, but about the nature of loyalty. Confession to a biographer was a form of institutional destruction. The palace's internal reality, the texture of royal marriages, the actual cost of the role, the gap between the public face and the private experience, had always been kept private precisely because it couldn't survive contact with public sympathy. Kept inside the walls, these realities were manageable. Made public, they became the public's property. And once the public had emotional ownership of the story, the institution could no longer control its meaning. Queen Elizabeth II had, as multiple sources confirm, made a virtue of hiding her emotions, a habit developed across decades and accelerated by the Queen Mother's example. The Queen's stoicism wasn't a personality default. It was a deliberately maintained institutional posture, a choice renewed every day across 68 years on the throne. News that Diana had handed the palace's private reality to a journalist was, from inside that framework, something worse than personal betrayal. It was a structural attack on the operating principle that had held the institution together through its worst crises. The Queen Mother's worldview, as Shawcross documented it, rested on the explicit principle: not publicly complaining, not publicly explaining, keeping the institution's internal reality inside the institution, and presenting only the managed exterior to the world. This principle had been field-tested across the abdication, the war, the Wallace vendetta, the sacrifice of Margaret's romantic life. It had held. What it had not survived, what no one in that generation had fully anticipated, was the shift in public expectations produced by 30 years of increasingly intimate television. The public of the 1950s had accepted managed surfaces as the full picture, having no other reference point. The public of the 1990s had grown up watching people discuss their marriages, their illnesses, their private pain in broadcast interviews. Diana wasn't simply breaking the palace's code. She was speaking a language that the audience had already been taught to value. The Queen Mother and her contemporaries weren't obtuse. They simply had no framework for processing this transformation. Because for the entirety of their lives, the code had worked. They had paid its costs and received its protection. The idea that the cost could be refused and the protection lost anyway was genuinely incomprehensible, and comprehending it would have required them to question a logic that had structured their own survival. Queen Mary, the Queen Mother, and the chain Diana broke. Queen Mary, mother of Edward VIII, grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II, is the origin point of the pattern Diana ultimately broke. The New York Times, in 1959, reporting on her official biography, cited biographer James Pope Hennessy's conclusion that the 1936 abdication had been, in Queen Mary's own assessment, the most distressing or humiliating event of her life. Her son had abandoned the throne for a woman she regarded as entirely unsuitable, dismantling the institutional order she had structured her entire public existence to protect. Her response is the foundational data point of the multi-generational pattern. Edward VIII himself noted that Queen Mary evaded all discussion of the abdication, choosing instead to maintain appearances rather than engage with the reality of what had happened. A BMJ Medical Humanities study of the period notes that once the decision was final, Queen Mary's stoicism gave way in private to anger, but the anger remained private. The mourning, the fury, the horror, all contained. In public, she continued. The monarchy held, and she made that happen through the daily act of not saying what she actually felt. The Queen Mother was Queen Mary's inheritor in this, whether or not she would have described the lineage in those terms. She had absorbed the abdication as a personal catastrophe, carried the wartime monarchy on her own emotional infrastructure, maintained her characteristic warmth across 50 years of widowhood, and privately sustained a decades-long resentment toward Wallis Simpson that never once surfaced in a press statement. By the time Diana arrived in 1981, the Queen Mother was the most thoroughly refined version of the code that had ever existed. A woman in whom suppression had become so complete it was genuinely difficult to distinguish from equanimity. The code had become her character. The pattern across 3 generations runs as a direct line. Queen Mary endured the abdication in public silence, despite documented private devastation. The Queen Mother absorbed the abdication's aftermath, the wartime emergency, the Wallis vendetta, and decades later, the situation between Charles and Diana, publicly silent on all of it. Princess Margaret sacrificed her relationship with Townsend to institutional pressure, endured her own failing marriage, and publicly acknowledged neither. Then Diana, simultaneously, confessed to a biographer, gave an emotional television interview, and publicly questioned whether her husband was fit to be king. The institutional reaction tells the story of how seriously the breach was taken. After Diana's death in August 1997, Margaret's anger at what she saw as Diana's betrayal of the royal family didn't soften. She never forgave her for it, even in death. This wasn't simply personal anger toward a woman Margaret had once liked. It was the response of a woman who had paid an enormous personal cost for a code that Diana had publicly demonstrated was breakable, and who experienced that demonstration as a retroactive verdict on her own choices. There is one irony the record preserves. The Queen Mother had reportedly encouraged the match between Charles and Diana in the first place, despite Charles having serious doubts. She had actively supported the selection of the woman whose arrival would eventually demolish the principle she had spent 8 decades embodying. The old code reached forward in confidence and found something it had no precedent for. November 20th, 1995. The BBC Panorama crew smuggled their equipment into Kensington Palace in secret. The BBC's Board of Governors wasn't informed. Martin Bashir conducted the interview in Diana's sitting room, a domestic space deliberately chosen with its own implicit argument about intimacy versus institutional formality. The cameras recorded a room that looked like somewhere a person actually lived, not a stage set arranged for distance. Diana sat in pronounced dark eye makeup, a detail noted by observers at the time as a deliberate visual choice. The shadows gave her face a quality of visible suffering that the camera amplified precisely as intended. Her posture was upright, her voice was steady, and then it trembled, and then it steadied again. She looked directly at the lens at intervals that felt spontaneous but were, in their cumulative effect, impossible to look away from. The interview aired at 9 o'clock in the evening on November 20th, 1995. In the United Kingdom, nearly 23 million people watched it. Worldwide, the audience was estimated at 200 million across 100 countries. Those numbers aren't incidental context. They are the empirical proof of the thesis. More people chose to listen to Diana describe her pain in a single evening than the palace's managed silence had ever converted into unquestioning institutional loyalty. She had been moving toward this for years, even if she wouldn't have used that language. The Morton book, published in June 1992, had established the public's willingness to receive the story on her terms. The separation that same year had converted the story from rumor into documented fact. The Dimbleby documentary of 1994, in which Charles admitted his adultery, had removed whatever moral authority he retained as a counterweight. By November 1995, Diana had nothing left to lose institutionally and everything to gain publicly. The confessions arrived in sequence, each one a layer further than the palace had any precedent for managing. First, the marriage itself. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. 7 words. Camilla Parker Bowles was named, not by name, but in a way that made the name unnecessary, and the entire public understanding of the royal marriage was placed on a different foundation in a single sentence. Charles had admitted his adultery to Dimbleby in 1994, but Diana's framing was different in kind. It claimed not just that the affair had happened, but that it had been the structural condition of the marriage from the beginning, crowded from the start. Then, her mental health. Well, maybe I was the first person ever to be in this family who ever had depression or was ever openly tearful. And obviously that was daunting, because if you've never seen it before, how do you support it? It gave everybody a wonderful new label: Diana's unstable and Diana's mentally unbalanced. And unfortunately, that seems to have stuck. This was the code being read aloud, in the code's own language, in front of an audience the code had spent decades trying to keep uninformed. The palace's response to her distress, dismissal, relabeling, the characterization of genuine suffering as instability requiring management, was being described in precise institutional terms to 23 million people who had just been asked whether that seemed right. Then, her own admissions. She acknowledged self-harm. She acknowledged the bulimia as a symptom of what was going on in my marriage. I was crying out for help, but giving the wrong signals, and people were using my bulimia as a coat on a hanger. They decided that was the problem. Diana was unstable. She admitted her own affair with former Army officer James Hewitt. She admitted being very let down when he cooperated with a tell-all book. Then, Charles's fitness for kingship. Asked whether she thought he wanted to be king, she said she knew there had always been conflict on that subject with him, and that being king would be a little bit more suffocating, given his character. She said she didn't know whether he could adapt to that. An heir's wife, on camera, in front of the largest British television audience of the year, expressing calibrated public doubt about his suitability for the position he had spent his entire adult life preparing to occupy. Royal biographer Katie Nichols' assessment: her casting doubt on Charles's ability to be a good king was hugely damaging to the institution. There is a fine balance between using TV as a medium to royal advantage and not letting too much daylight into the mystique of monarchy. Diana had just removed the balance entirely. Historian Carolyn Harris described the dual-track damage: personal strain on Princes William and Harry, and Diana publicly critiquing Charles's suitability to be king. The Queen could see the damage it was causing to the monarchy as an institution. A month after the interview was filmed, Queen Elizabeth II wrote letters to both Charles and Diana, urging them to finalize their divorce. The palace had concluded that Diana's method had succeeded in the one direction it couldn't allow to continue. Containment had failed. The only available response was to change the legal status of the relationship that gave Diana her access to the royal platform. A necessary caveat belongs here. Lord Dyson's independent inquiry, published May 20, 2021, found beyond doubt that Martin Bashir used forged bank statements to gain Diana's trust
and secure the interview, feeding her fears about palace surveillance to increase her willingness to speak. Prince William subsequently stated the interview had been a major contribution to making my parents' relationship worse. Diana later handwrote a statement from Kensington Palace defending the interview regardless. She knew what she had said. She stood by it. What the Dyson inquiry can't retroactively eliminate is the fact that 23 million viewers made a decision about whom to believe that November evening, or that the palace's institutional response, a letter from the Queen urging divorce, acknowledged the outcome even as it condemned the method. The palace's manners lost the argument in real time. The letter was the written proof. The silence that never returned. Diana died in Paris on August 31, 1997. She was 36. What followed in the days after her death was the Queen Mother's nightmare made permanent. The public grief was physical, gathered around Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace in quantities the institution's standard protocols couldn't manage. Queen Elizabeth II, trained by her mother in precisely the code Diana had spent years dismantling, maintained palace protocol. No flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, no immediate televised address, the family remaining at Balmoral. The public interpreted this as coldness. The palace interpreted the public's interpretation as irrational. Neither side could translate the other's language, because Diana had permanently changed what royal language could contain. The Queen's televised address on September 5th, 5 days after the death, was a managed concession to Diana's precedent. She came to London. She spoke, as the broadcast record shows, from the heart as both queen and a grandmother. She described Diana as an exceptional and gifted human being, a characterization unrecognizable to the palace staffers who had spent years describing her as unstable. The institution publicly acknowledged, in front of cameras, that emotional visibility couldn't simply be refused. It was the old code's first formal defeat in 80 years. The Queen Mother died on March 30, 2002, at 101. The mourning was genuine, dignified, and considerably more calibrated than what 1997 had produced. Not because people cared less about her, but because Diana had permanently reset the emotional register the public brought to royal deaths. The Queen Mother's passing belonged to the old dispensation. Diana's had inaugurated a new one. In March 2021, 24 years after Diana's death, Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, sat with Oprah Winfrey and described mental health crises, institutional failure, and the cruelty of silence maintained for institutional reasons. The interview reached a global audience of 49 million viewers. The structural parallel to the 1995 Panorama broadcast wasn't coincidental. Once a royal had demonstrated that personal truth could command a larger audience than institutional management, the template was available to anyone inside the institution who found themselves in the same position. The Queen Mother had not merely been outflanked, her operating principle had been rendered obsolete. The Queen Mother survived by making pain invisible. Across the abdication, the war, the Wallace vendetta, 50 years of widowhood, her grandson's marriage collapsing in slow public motion. Pain absorbed, transmuted, and redirected into institutional performance. A code maintained at enormous personal cost over decades, producing in return the most sustained public adoration any member of the British royal family had ever received. She died at 101, inside the institution's complete approval. Diana survived, as long as she survived, by making pain impossible to ignore. A trembling voice on camera drew 23 million viewers. A letter from the Queen urged divorce. The palace's acknowledgement that it had lost was more conclusive than any editorial verdict could have been. Diana's exact private thoughts about the Queen Mother aren't always directly documented. The specific texture of their individual encounters wasn't preserved in any source that survives with full credibility. But the structure of the conflict is clear, even where private words are missing. Diana seems to have understood the Queen Mother's warmth as precisely what it was: genuine in its expression, architectural in its function. A smile refined across 8 decades of public exposure into something that served both the woman wearing it and the institution it protected. She recognized it because she had been asked to replicate it. The Queen Mother belonged to a monarchy where women smiled through betrayal and called it duty. Diana belonged to a television age where a trembling voice could do more damage than a constitutional crisis. She recognized the Queen Mother's smile because by the end, she had been asked to wear one too. She took it off instead. Subscribe for more stories like this.